Welcome to Truth Be Told. I'm your host, Tony Sweet. Today we are diving into the intriguing world of UFOs with author and journalist Keith Thompson, who has spent decades researching this phenomenon. Keith's book, The UFO Paradox, The Celestial and Symbolic World of Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon, offers a unique insight into UFO encounters, blending witness reports with skeptical theories. He explores UFOs against the backdrop of visionary experiences like angelic visitations, near-death experiences, and shamanic journeys. We'll discuss his conversations with notable figures like Harvard psychiatrist John Mack, Laurance S. Rockefeller, and astronaut Edgar Mitchell, shedding light on the nature of UFOs as both physical and spiritual phenomenons. So join us today as we explore the mysteries of the UFO phenomenon and its call to expand our understanding of reality. I'm your host, Tony Sweet. Please welcome to the Truth Be Told studios for the first time, author and journalist, Keith Thompson. There he is. Wherever he goes, that's all he gets, that every single time. How you doing, Keith?
It's great to be with you. Thank you for your audience. It's so delightful. I hope to stay around afterwards and get to know
each and every one.
I understand there's a parting gift for me of some kind.
There is a kick in the ass. No, just kidding.
I do the interview well.
A kick in the ass. That's what my mom always said to me. Get out. You're 18. Well, one thing I said at the end is, reality. And, these days we don't know what is real and what's not even kind of just in our minds. But I'm hoping you can kind of bring some light to what we're going to be talking about today. And, I mean, first of all, the book itself, the artwork is just gorgeous. And I appreciate you putting something so, with the colors, and just the title is great. So, but one thing I tell people all the time, I've been doing this a long time, is everybody has a story. I don't care if they go, oh, I really don't believe in paranormal, but then you'll bring up a ghost or you bring up UFO and they're like, well, one time I think I might have saw something. Well, they've heard my story. I kind of want to hear your story, what happened or what you encountered, because people in this industry always have some type of encounter. So can you tell us your story, how you got interested in the paranormal realm?
Yeah, I will. I will tell you. Sort of, there's an objective story that I followed in terms of my path as a reporter when
Right.
I was sort of a young reporter, and I can tell that real briefly. And then I can tell you a personal story that is more of the subjective side, having to do with the non-ordinary or the paranormal. The objective side was I was 12 years old. It was the sixth grade. It was my turn to give a current events report in class. Right. The idea that each of us would find a story that's going on and come in as a reporter and tell the class about it and take questions. It was a great experiment, a great experience. I was living and raised in Northwest Ohio at the time, and there was a UFO sighting near Ann Arbor, Michigan that was legendary. It lasted 3 or 4 days. These were the times when the CBS Evening News, or NBC, ABC would lead with the opening story would be Walter. I can still remember tuning in and Walter Cronkite saying, "The remarkable UFO story in Ann Arbor, Michigan continues to unfold in remarkable and extraordinary ways. We now go to Bob Schieffer, who's on the site." So I was tuned in, and I had no dog in the hunt in terms of any preconceived views about the subject. And so I told my class about a particular sighting in Ann Arbor, that the Air Force had sent in an Air Force investigator named J. Allen Hynek, a prominent astronomer who had signed on to help the Air Force investigate these things. He went around the town, went around the area, was squired around. He talked to talk to witnesses, I should say, and visited all of the hot spots, including one part of town near a swamp. And he took the measure of what happened there and what was reported there. And he considered that it's possible in that particular site alone, it might have been, could have been, possibly, he thought it very tentatively. He said it could have been swamp gas, which is a real natural phenomenon, as you know.
Right, yes.
In which degraded material, biophosphorants, that is to say, luminous phenomena arise out of the decay of vegetables and in a natural, in the gas that rises, methane and so forth. So with that in mind, he stood up in front of a news conference with journalists from around the country in a school auditorium, and he began to go down the list of the areas of town that were affected. And he mentioned the sighting in the swamp area. And again, he qualified it as it could have been, might have been, unknown, but it could have been swamp gas. He stood there at the podium, Tony, and watched mortified as the reporters from around the country swarmed out of the room, went to the bank of payphones and called their news bureaus and said, Hynek, Air Force, reduce, explain it all away as swamp gas. It was not an accurate account of everything that had happened, but that caught my attention as a young observer of the news and aspiring journalist, you might say. I said, this is the story. Something was reported by people. It was not consistent with the idea of swamp gas, and even he didn't say it was swamp gas. So when I gave this report to my class and focused on that particular contradiction, came time for questions and answers, and one of my classmates, I can still remember this, is all very vivid in the way that a young memory can hold on to something and keep it fresh. One of my classmates said, do you think it's aliens from outer space? And I said, I was a little surprised by the question. I wasn't ready to call an interpretation. I said, well, I don't know, but that's what some people think it must be if it's not, explained as a natural phenomenon or
Right.
misidentification. Then the next question was, well, if not that, what do you think it was? What did these people see? This is a fellow student. And I said, again, I don't know. And Tony, that was not a punt. That was not a dodge. I
Right.
didn't know what they saw, but I did say to my classmate, it isn't, it doesn't resemble swamp gas. What people reported does not resemble swamp gas. So at that point, my teacher came up. We were done with the report. She said, I can still vividly remember standing there next to her, and she said, what Keith seems to be saying, what I think Keith is saying, is that in cases like this, with these kind of phenomena, we should keep an open mind and be willing to ask relevant questions. I stood there and I felt a glow that was like a benediction or a blessing that a teacher at that age of my life had acknowledged me, the contribution I had intended to make and attempted to make. And it was really a remarkable encouragement to me to sort of stay on the path of observing things. She concluded by turning to me and said, Mr. Thompson, the way that teachers will talk to a
Right.
young student, Mr. Thompson, you have the makings of a journalist or a scientist, maybe
Wow.
even a detective. She said, follow the evidence wherever it leads. And that was the end. We went to recess. I got to be a kid again.
I love that. I love
Yeah,
that.
that teacher has, I mean, this is, we're all blessed if we have that kind of, like a
Hmm.
benediction from a teacher. Many of us come away with bad experiences, a bad day with the teacher who takes delight in making us feel dumb. That can be a life-defining experience as well. I fortunately never had any of those. So I can't say I became a UFO investigator that day. I got encouragement to be an investigator of life. Any part of life that interested me, I could bring the powers of observation and critical observation of detail and taking good notes and being a good observer. I realized that day when I was a young empiricist, take an empirical approach, collect the reports, and then interpret them, then see what is the best pattern that fits the results or fits the observations. So that's what got me on this path as a journalist. Then, in terms of my own direct encounter with the larger universe, with the paranormal, the spiritual, 2 years later, I had a practice that my parents didn't know about. I like to go out onto a roof of our house. We had a big house, a big family, and we were 3 stories high. We weren't allowed to go onto the roof because it was dangerous. But I would go onto the roof, and that day I did, and I would just lay back. It was my time to find solace and peace, like that song from the 1960s, "Up on the Roof,"
Oh yeah.
when
Yeah.
the whole world starts getting you down and people are much too much for you to take. So I'd go up on the roof, and one day, while being on the roof, lying on my back, I looked out into the sky, and with no purpose or aim, just simply opened myself up, and I suddenly found that I was everywhere at once, but no place in particular. And the sense of being at home and at peace was astonishing. It wasn't a frightening experience, like how did I come into this strange corridor? it was simply a sense of, like I say, everywhere at once, but no place in particular. I was surrounded with a sense of brilliance that seemed to lift me beyond time and space. Uh, and I had a sense that this was not only not some aberration, but that I was seeing reality at its heart and its soul. And I should add that my family was not particularly religious. We would go to church occasionally because essentially the idea was it's good for good people to be seen going to church, right? Go to
Right.
church to be a good person. But we were not particularly religious in terms of dogma, and I never really got that far in church as a young person in terms of being introduced to core theological stuff. So I did not have a religious orientation, but I knew this was a religious experience. I said, this is center court. This is soul, spirit, God. Oh, here's the fun thing. I came down from the roof. I didn't go inside or wait for my parents to come home or tell my brothers. Oh, guess what? I just experienced a complete separation, a lack of separation between me and the rest of the universe, a oneness that goes to the heart of very reality. No, I didn't say anything about it because I knew, being a Midwestern kid, that's not the kind of a report that's going to go down well. Keith must have a problem. There wasn't a time when kids were being medicated the way
Right.
they are
Right.
now, but I probably would have been a good candidate for some kind of Ritalin. So I cite those two experiences. One is the objective experience as a kind of a cub reporter giving a reporting class, and the second was this mystical experience. And I say mystical because it actually motivated me to take up meditation later,
Hmm.
starting
Wow.
with transcendental TM meditation or the training program. Then I discovered Buddhist Vipassana meditation. I read Robert Monroe's books, Journey Out of the Body. I read that much later when I had an out of body experience. So there was a, and to follow a spiritual path, it was at that time to read people like Alan Watts and some of the great spiritual popularizers. So I began to see that in moments of silence, in meditation retreats, in contemplation, in being in the redwoods, being on a beach with seagulls, this silence was really at the heart of things. And it's what mystics, I found that this was a mystical perception, a sense of the core unity at the heart of things. So that became part of my framework. I
Wow.
didn't know it at the time, but that became part of the framework for a sense of wonder and astonishment. And having been introduced to the UFO phenomenon as a young student reporter, the two went together pretty well.
One and for people that's just tuning in, this is Keith Thompson, journalist, author, talk radio host. Uh, he wrote a book that just released, the UFO Paradox. But in 1993, you wrote a book, Angels and Aliens, which I think you're kind of a little ahead of your time because not very many people associated the two together. Um, I know I've interviewed a few people in the last few years about deciphering the encounters, if they were angelic figures versus alien beings. Um, so I kind of wouldn't mind starting there before we actually really jump into the book, the current book.
Yeah, the
Um,
first, go
what
ahead.
is your feeling as a journalist, um, of doing the research that you did with the two go together in some ways, and how did you determine which was which?
Well, good. A good question. Let me add too. I don't consider myself. I was asked recently when I began talking about this new book. Somebody asked me an interesting question that seemed to make a lot of sense to them, but kind of left me with a cocked head. They said, "When did you give up being a? When did you move? How did you make the shift from being an investigative journalist covering all kinds of topics in the mainstream to becoming a UFO investigator?"
Right.
And I said, "Well, oh wait, no, I don't see it as a shift. I'm always been, and I consider my work to be an investigative
Yeah.
journalist. I do investigative journalism. It just happens now that I've turned my attention to something that is considered almost outside the realm of mainstream. Well, it is in some sense, but I said, no, I consider them part and parcel. So to ask the question about what is the relationship of, say, between angels and aliens, I look at it this way. The flying saucer frame of reference. Think of the entire UFO phenomenon, the
Hmm.
saucer phenomenon that began in 1947 with the pilot Kenneth Arnold,
Right.
who saw objects over Mount Rainier. Maybe we talk about that before the interview is over. In any case, that is the beginning of the modern era. That was the creation story or creation myth of the modern UFO phenomenon. So I came to see at some point, let's call that the flying saucer frame of reference. Then I began to look at the possibility and look at some evidence. Well, wait a minute. These kind of encounters between humans and non-ordinary, extraordinary, numinous beings have been reported throughout all time.
Mm-hmm.
So then it brought me into the framework of the angels in Christianity, the angels and demons, and the jinn in Islamic. That's an Jinn is a name for spirit beings in the Islamic philosophy. And in mythology after mythology, culture after culture, there is some, including the Celtic fairy faith,
Yeah.
have encounters between humans and fairies. So I began to think perhaps this is a common, a larger phenomenon that each culture interprets according to its belief systems. I was influenced by the writer Jacques Vallée, who wrote a
Oh
beautiful
yeah.
book in the
Mm-hmm.
60s called Passport to Magonia. So I give him credit for opening my eyes. So with that in mind, there's the saucer frame of reference, the angelic demonic frame of reference. Then there's the shamanic frame of reference. The shamans in indigenous cultures are those figures who have special openings and special trainings, encountering the beings in the lower world, the middle realm, and the upper realm. And they bring back insight for the tribe, for the people, the community around healing and insight of various kinds. So there's the shamanic frame. So I began to simply compare the various frames, not reduce them to each other, but ended up calling the book Angels and Aliens, UFOs and the Mythic Imagination. And by mythic imagination, I meant that I was drawn also, both as a young person and also as a young scholar, to the realms of mythology, Greek mythology, and other systems that have these figures like Hermes, the trickster, or
Mm.
Proteus, the shapeshifter, who could change his shape into any form to meet any situation. I noticed that the UFO shapes changed in,
Right. Right.
I mean, literally, they appear to be like a paraphysical phenomenon that move into our to our agreed dimensions of time and space, three dimensions of space, one of time, and then they manifest, then they disappear. They often just disappear on the spot. So that phenomena then opened me to another frame. That perspective opened me to the other frame. That's the paranormal in general, the broad realm of paranormal research, telepathy, clairvoyance, psychokinesis, precognitive dreams. So I put together a large framework in that first book. And in this book, I wanted to delve more deeply into some of tell the story of many of the people. It's just more of a first-person book. It could almost be subtitled "My Story as an Investigator of Remarkable Phenomena." I wanted to show the reader how I had gone down a path of asking questions, not necessarily to come up with final answers, but to show others you can take an inquisitive approach to this,
Hmm.
and that's very fertile to do so.
No, I totally on the same page as you. And I know in your book you explore UFO encounters alongside like visionary experiences with angelic visitations and near death experiences, shamanic. I always say shamanic, but shamanic journeys and religious miracles. How do these experiences intersect, and what common thread do you find between them?
Well, what's common is that we do not we're not the lone cowboy in this world. Most of the mythologies of the world have hierarchies in which I mean, if you study Dante in the Middle Ages, you find his beautiful diagrams of the universe as multi-leveled hierarchies, and orbits, circles around circles with beings and levels. And in the past 300 years, our mechanistic, materialist view of science did a complete reversal of that, partly because religious sources were not empirical. We had to we had to separate away from religious dogma in order
Mm-hmm.
for the great discoveries of science to take place, the great empirical discoveries. Now we've almost gone too far in trying to get beyond any faith, taking things on faith, We've simply turned away from the inner world and its relationship to the outer world. And as you know, as a student of the paranormal, simply because you close out phenomena that you don't believe in doesn't mean the phenomena stops believing in you. It continues to show up. I think that's part of the, if you might say, the teaching of this phenomenon. For a while, I used to think that the immediate response when people would report extraordinary sightings, the immediate response of the debunker,
Hmm.
who's not a real skeptic. There's a certain kind of a character that shows up in these sightings and in the public discussion of the sightings. Is essentially a debunker. They speak in the name of science, but instead of being open-minded skeptics and asking critical questions, they attempt to debunk the witness. That couldn't have happened. It didn't happen because these things can happen. We know from the laws of science there are no way these things can happen. And I looked at that for a while as a kind of gatekeeping phenomenon, the way in which that response closed down uh, these experiences. In some sense, I still think that's true. At this point, no, and I'm more inclined to think, Tony, that these phenomena are coming precisely to individuals. They're sort of bypassing the gatekeepers, the agents of official culture in
Hmm.
science, academia, and the media. And so there's some kind of direct reintroduction. People are having these experiences that are technically impossible. That's the key. These are impossible phenomena, according to our science, and they're happening to ordinary people.
What just popped into my head, we talk on Truth Be Told a lot about past lives and also near death experiences. I wonder if there is any correlation between people having interaction with these beings and past life regressions versus just generational, because I've heard, oh, my grandmother had an experience, my mother had an experience, I had an experience, my child has an experience. It feels like it kind of got passed down through generations. But I'm wondering if there's ever been like a past life saying that, I've been here 10 times and all 10 times I've been, approached or abducted or been part of their experiments throughout my many times on this planet or different dimensions. I'm curious. Have you ever heard anything about that?
Well, it's a great question because one of the main researchers of the abduction phenomenon,
Mm-hmm.
a professor of history named David Jacobs, who's now retired at Temple University, professor of history. He didn't do this in his day job, but in his private life, he developed an interest in the abduction aspect of the phenomenon, UFO phenomenon, and became known as one of the leaders of those who would use hypnosis regression to help people get their memories. And in one of his books, while I was preparing for this book, I was struck by his candor, his strange candor, in which he acknowledged and admitted how he selected a legitimate candidate
Hmm.
for abduction, as opposed to somebody who was probably confabulating or might be having mistaken experiences. And it was ironic to find that if he found that someone described that in addition to the abduction, they have spiritual experiences, or if they spoke about having reincarnation experiences, because he had a strong materialist bias himself, and was a realist in the strict historical sense. He didn't have any opening to the spiritual stuff, and he actually tended to exclude from his pool of legitimate abductees people who reported paranormal experiences. And I wrote about this. I said I have great respect for this guy going into this field and giving credence to these to the experiences that people report. But it is a kind of selection bias to exclude people because they don't fit his particular viewpoint.
Hmm.
I mean, why wouldn't a person who might be legitimately able to make a claim of having an abduction experience by aliens also have a spiritual? In other words, they're not necessarily separate. He wanted to keep the realm separate because he thought spirituality was all psychological.
Right.
That
Right.
that past life responses, past life reports could be entirely explained as psychological. Well, the same criticism is wedged by skeptics and debunkers against abduction phenomena.
Hmm.
And to exclude the paranormal, as you know, there is really good research in laboratories now, in addition to anecdotal evidence from our everyday lives, synchronistic experiences, and so forth, there's really good laboratory research now on telepathy, clairvoyance, the experience of being stared at. How does someone know they're being stared at when there is no, this has nothing to do with the UFO phenomenon, but it's related. When
Right.
someone knows they're being, has a strong sense that they're being stared at, someone's looking at them and there's no sensory cues. They look behind them at the store.
Yeah.
Someone is staring,
I've done it.
and they make eye contact, like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." But that isn't the point. It isn't the content of the staring. It's the fact that you knew it. There's non-sensory knowing
Wow.
that we have availability to all the time. So to exclude that stuff from the data pool, in many ways, contaminated the early abduction reports in disappointing ways.
I love that you say that because I think as you as a journalist, I don't consider myself a journalist, but you as a journalist, I'm sure those senses are kind of heightened because that's something that you need to be aware of all your surroundings, not just what your one thing you're focused on. Because I had a friend of mine used to say, when you're so focused this way, he goes, you're missing out on the full range of your peripheral and behind you when you're only focused this way. So I think what you do is probably your senses are heightened to look at all aspects of what you're doing your
I think I
investigation
got
on.
trained in that in my early work as a journalist. You write a feature story about a particular phenomenon.
Right.
I remember I did a story on the homeschooling revolution over 10 years ago, and I found a homeschool family, and I interviewed them, talked to the kids, talked to others in the community. I addressed the issue, for example, of, oh, it's said that homeschool children don't have proper socialization. They don't play with other kids. If you educate your kids at home,
Right.
you're not going to have the environment of socializing. Nonsense. First of all, you're going to get by a lot. You're going to not have to deal with a lot of the socialization that happens through public schools, which these days a lot of parents are concerned about which
Right.
kids you hang with. Whereas in a homeschool environment, you often have a skepticism toward public schools, so you have a lot of socializing in homeschooling. You go to field trips together, you go on adventures together, you go to museums together. So I resolved that issue. There's no socialization. Yes, there is. And then I also talked to critics of the homeschool, revolution.
Right.
So anyway, I kind of have a natural. I come to the UFO phenomenon with that training to get multiple viewpoints. And again, my sixth grade teacher, follow the evidence where it leads. I didn't, as a 12th grade student, have any inclination to believe the UFO phenomenon had anything to do with paranormal or visionary, mystical experience. I didn't have any of those experiences myself until I did have
Right.
a
Right.
mystical visionary experience. And later in my 20s, a near death experience before the near
Wow.
death experience was even known, the stages. So that was an adventure because I'd gone through the complete cycle of the near death. It was a near drowning off the coast of Hawaii. And I did not have an immediate, oh, I've had a near death experience because I've read the book by called Life After Life by Raymond Moody, or I've
Right.
seen the
Right.
Oprah episodes which she had made famous. No, that stuff, I'm old enough as a middle era baby boomer to have not had those introductions. So I had to find my way through the experience of near death without knowing that it's actually something that was very commonly reported.
What I want to tell people in the chat room, please, if you have a question, I call you my co-host because you come up with some great questions for Keith. Please leave them in the chat room. In fact, we have one from Richard. I hope you don't mind us asking one from Richard in the chat room.
Sure, I'd love to.
All right. So he says, does Keith believe that the phenomenon is more than just little green men from planet X, or does he think UFOs, Bigfoots, ghosts, etc., are all linked?
Well, that's the premise of my book. I don't deal specifically with Bigfoot or the cryptids because you have to set some boundaries somewhere.
Right.
But I've gone pretty far. Again, all these different concentric circles, the UFO frame of reference, the Bigfoot frame of reference, the near-death phenomenon, both the near-death and the alien abduction phenomenon deal with beings who are humanoid, who are spirit-bodied, and so, yeah, I think there's a common matrix. I actually have been surprised with my book. I think maybe 10 years ago, the idea of anything beyond the UFO frame of reference was controversial. You'd say, look, if they're not misidentifications and hoaxes and hallucinations, if there's anything going on that isn't just mundane, it must be extraterrestrial in the sense that Steven Spielberg has told us.
Hmm.
Well, there may be a percentage of them that are, in fact, we live in a big universe. You know, the scientists who talk to us about the likelihood of life being a very generously distributed phenomenon are very high. Those percentages of the likelihood is great. That said, uh, I have found a great openness to this idea that the paranormal, for example, and the UFO phenomenon and the near-death phenomenon and shamanism are part of the same matrix. And I think partly what it is, Tony, is that for over 20 years, a large number of, let's just say here in America, the United States, but also around the world, people have been practicing meditation, practicing inner growth techniques.
Right.
And I think it's reasonable to say that there has been an increase, a change, a shift in the baseline of consciousness itself. Consciousness is influenced by the growing percentage of people, growing numbers of people who are practicing consciousness exploration techniques and methods and so forth. So when a growing number of people say, "I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual," that's a new distinction, and it has to do generally with experience. People who turn to spirituality are people who've had experiences of a larger world that are not explained by the conventional religions in general and not taken seriously by science. So I think there's a growing interest and willingness to do what uh, the chat room, the question in the chat room, is it Richard, did you
Richard,
say?
right.
Yeah, Richard's question about is it part of a larger framework that includes these? I do. I think so. I think that's a very fruitful way to. That's the way I'm proceeding, and I'm open to. My view is I'm an explore. I'm trying to take a scientific in the best sense. I'm not a scientist, but I'm a journalist, which is my teacher told me. You could be a journalist or a detective or a scientist. What do they all have in common? If you're a detective, you don't come to a whodunit when somebody is murdered at the mansion on the top of the hill,
Right.
and you
Facts.
don't exclude the butler simply because you like him,
Right. Right.
you know him in your life to be a good person. He might be a good person, except when he's killing people. So you don't exclude people. You listen to their stories. You look for alibis. If somebody's got an alibi
Right.
that's an airtight alibi, then you exclude them. So same with hypotheses. I will push the hypothesis off the table that these aren't all connected when I find some reason to think that's the case. But I look for parallels between them all. And angelic encounters are in many ways similar to the abduction encounters.
I love
Among
that. I think that's a great answer to his question. I hope that answered your question, Richard. And one thing that I think you've proven is your years of journalism. I think when you're a good journalist, people begin to trust you and start to believe that you're going to be respectful to their studies and their research. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the discussions that you've had with some very influential people, such as John Mack and Laurance Rockefeller and Edgar Mitchell. Can you talk about some of these conversations that really shaped your understanding in the phenomenon of paranormal or UFO? Or I think that's probably had some clout in the way you wrote your book.
Yeah, I will be happy to. Well, after had written Angels and Aliens, I was surprised one day to get a phone call from Laurance Rockefeller's office in New York City. I knew who Laurance Rockefeller was. He was the one of the Rockefeller brothers who was interested in philosophy and social change in a certain kind. He was a great conservationist, and I knew that he was interested in the UFO phenomenon broadly. So I received a call, was put through to this man with the beautiful, there he is, at the beautiful northeastern accent, and I will tell you how he sounded when I picked up the phone. He said, "Mr. Thompson, this is Laurance Rockefeller. I'm sitting here with your book, the Angels and Aliens, and I must say you take a big picture view of the phenomenon. Would that be accurate?" I thought, wow, what an opening. So I said, well, yes, and by the way, please call me Keith. Then he said, well, then you call me Laurance, and we'll have the formalities all settled. And so I said, by big picture, you mean the way I make the connections between the various phenomena And he said, and including consciousness, you have an understanding that that's got to be accounted for in these. And I don't fully understand it, but I think you're on to something. And then he also said to me, he said, you don't seem to have any enemies in this field.
Hmm.
And I thought, well, that's an interesting. I said, if you mean I don't go out of my way to pick fights with people, I don't. I don't make a point of saying who's wrong about this phenomenon.
Right.
I sometimes think people, some researchers are claiming things for which they don't have much evidence, but this field, as you may know, the UFO field, partly because the phenomenon seems to constantly be elusive, almost fugitive,
Right.
it tends to reinforce in the investigators an overdependence on being certain. What they're not certain about, when you can't be certain about the core of the phenomenon, you can be certain about some aspect of it, and you lay claim to that. I've never had any interest in laying claim to facts. So in any case, what he was calling about, in addition to sort of being interested in this bigger picture philosophically, was he was assembling an initiative to reach out to then President Clinton and Hillary Clinton, both of whom had expressed interest in the UFO phenomenon.
Really?
And he said, I am going to gather a group of people at my ranch at the JY Ranch in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And he said, would you be willing to come to that? And we're going to brainstorm a plan to try to get more transparency. And I almost jokingly said, well, let me check my schedule. I'm quite the busy man. But I didn't. I said, I think I can make it. And he said, good, I'll have one of my associates call you about details. And then he said, would you be willing to come a couple of days early before it begins? And you and I can talk about these larger sides of things that don't deal with, the government disclosure. So again, I cite that because I had kind of put my thinking out, the kind of big picture approach in my first book, and it had come to his attention. His book had crossed his desk, and he had his own reasoning that made him think there was a larger pattern or a larger matrix that we needed to understand. So to summarize, I went to this meeting. It involved some of the leading researchers, including John Mack from Harvard, who I'd be glad to talk about.
I would love to hear that, yes.
and we talked about the need to focus in. So we decided that the Roswell case would be the one. Ask the Clinton administration, instead of trying to say, come clean on UFOs in general,
right,
which is possibly slippery assignment. We agreed, let's focus in on Roswell. So an inquiry was made in behalf of Rockefeller with President Clinton's science advisor, John Gibbons, and the report came back after a period of time. We're sorry to report that we have found nothing that questions the government's statement that it was simply a weather balloon. There was already reason to doubt that story, and that in retrospect, it might have been naive to think that maybe the people who were holding this information so tightly would be willing to let it go. But there's no doubt something happened at Roswell. That's a case that's worth a couple of hours of conversation.
Right.
Something happened, something crashed there, whether it was extraterrestrial and there were recovered aliens, or whether it was some kind of a more recent theory by a journalist has been that it was a Soviet craft that came through the Straits of Bering or the Bering Straits, I should say, and it crashed. And I can say for sure the government went to great effort to pick up every bit of what had crashed, went door to door, telling people, if you picked up any of the debris, you need to let it go. You need to release it. So something happened. It's very consistent with an extraterrestrial event, but it could have been a top secret crash that had gone awry. But in any case, it was very informative and educational to be part of that kind of a surprising effort. Would I be willing to try to help get the President of the United States to release this information? I'll do whatever I could.
We all wish that. I mean, in some ways, they've kind of opened the door a little bit when, the recent about the Navy talking about some of the sightings and saying, pretty much, yeah, they're there. We just don't know if they are or who they are and all this stuff. So it's nice to hear that, but sometimes you're like, why don't you just finally just let the door open and let it flood out? It's not like we're back in the, go ahead.
what we found out after the inquiry was over and we got back the news, there's nothing to see here, go away, return to your lives,
Right,
people.
right.
We found that the records related to Roswell had been systematically purged.
Oh,
Nobody quite explained how it had happened, but up to 2 years prior, everything related to the Roswell base had been deleted. So the very inquiry seemed to involve the covering of tracks. Why something that many decades ago would still be so significant?
right.
It's the kind of a fact that keeps this phenomenon very much alive.
Well, let's talk about John Mack a little bit more because you did some introduction of the alien abduction accounts. Can you talk about that? We've talked about John Mack before, but that's something that I think is very fascinating of bringing the psychology part of it into what you're doing. I would love to hear more about that if you can.
Good, be glad to tell you. He's another one who sort of came onto what he was doing. He discovered my work in the process of doing what he was doing. I had given a talk at a UFO conference in which I had described, I kind of said to the talk, to the people I spoke to, they were actually people who had had these experiences. I had studied with Joseph Campbell's model in the book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, in which he describes how the hero's journey involves setting out on a quest of adventure. And sometimes one goes on this quest involuntarily. Sometimes life events will pick you up and separate you from your ordinary, conventional sense of reality,
Right.
just as the UFO phenomenon had done that for me as a journalist, and that experience on the rooftop had separated me from my opening sense of what's real. Then you go through a long period of in the middle ground, trying to make sense of it. You're in the margins of life. You're not who you used to be, and you sense there's something that's going to come out of this that hasn't come yet. And then the third stage that Campbell talked about, the completion of the rite of passage or the initiation, is a return to your society, but with new clarity, often in the form of an insight for
Hmm.
the rest of the culture. So I had simply said, to the abductees. Think of your own experience. You've some kind of initiation. Your experience matches this stage, these descriptions, Joseph Campbell's description of the hero's journey. So you may not feel that you're on a heroic journey, but you've been introduced to something, and take it seriously and give it the honor that you're being asked to understand something. So it was a framework of empowering individuals to make the most of what had seemed an involuntary experience. So John Mack at Harvard, psychiatrist, fantastic scholar, Pulitzer Prize winning author of a biography about Lawrence of Arabia. I knew who John Mack was. So when he contacted me and said, I read your piece about how these have an initiatory structure to them, but I also noticed that when you talked about it that way, you said, let's set aside the question of whether they're real and let's just simply look at these parallels to rites of passage. Well, great. I'm interested in those rites of passage myself, but are they real? So he said, that's what I want to talk with you about. He came to me. I was many years his junior, so he kind of looked at me as a certain kind of almost mentor. But it really didn't last very long because we were both on the same level. We were both peers exploring these questions. And he likewise he took the abductee cases seriously. He determined, for example, those who think, oh, the people who report alien abduction, that's direct evidence there must be something wrong with their heads.
Hmm.
But he found there is no pre-existing psychological disorder that makes someone prone to an abduction. There may be psychological problems afterwards. If you believe you've been taken out of your bedroom
Right.
or your car by force, including light that seems to lift you into the air inside an apparent waiting craft, this is what's reported. So at what level it's happening and on how many levels of reality are involved in that is part
Right.
of the question. But if you believe that, you're going to probably have some difficulties adjusting. You're going to have some symptoms,
Right.
but there is no evidence that the abductees as a group are psychologically disturbed. So he was a major researcher. He paid a price. Part of the John Mack saga is that Harvard began to say, John, this is not what we want to be doing at Harvard. And he said, Who's the we here?
Right,
I have
right.
tenure. I'm part of Harvard. We were friends yesterday. What is it about this subject? Well, this subject is pretty far out, and we don't know if you can prove what you're claiming. He said, what exactly am I claiming? I'm claiming there are people who make extraordinary sightings and reports of encounters that don't make sense. Yes, and according to certain assumptions we all hold dear. The idea that was brought up by Alan Dershowitz, the
Hmm.
famous lawyer we see on television a lot, he went to John Mack's defense. He spoke up and said, we have a divinity school at Harvard where it's okay to talk about human encounters with angels.
Right.
Aliens are too far out. He said, if John Mack is mistaken, let other academics prove he's mistaken.
Wow.
Let's allow academic freedom. So John Mack was a crusader. Harvard eventually backed down. They didn't agree with what he was doing necessarily, but they understood that under the license or the freedom of investigation that the academic community is supposed to enjoy, he was very much within his rights to ask these larger questions. So it was a great victory for freedom of thought.
Yeah, and yeah, and like Richard said in the chat room, it says John Mack was treated terribly, and I think, if we could move forward, 20, 30 years, I think definitely it may have been a different story, but because of the times, even 30 years ago, people even saying I believe in UFOs or I've seen a UFO or I've seen a ghost, people would look at you oddly, where now because of Ancient Aliens and all these other ghost hunters and different types of shows, that's kind of made it more mainstream. I think people now are very more open to it, to where it's more acceptable to investigate more easier and do these studies and without being criticized. I mean, I'm sure they're still going to get it, but it's not as.
Well, a good example is the near-death phenomenon as a field of scientific research. And it's not widely known that some of the best researchers who eventually decided to take the near-death reports seriously were the doctors, surgeons who worked with people who, when they would come out of their anesthesia, would report having left their body,
Oh yeah.
especially those who had flatlined around the heartbeat and the brain waves. They
Yeah.
were they were clinically dead or very close to it. So they come back, they survive, the anesthesia wears off, the doctor comes in with his clipboard and says to the patient, "Well, are you ready to discuss your prognosis? The surgery is over." And the patient would say, "Well, I already know my prognosis. I overheard you and Dr. Smith in the East Wing this morning talking about it. You were eating a tuna salad sandwich
Wow.
and you spilled it on your tie. That the fact that's that stain right there on your tie. By the way, right outside this room on the ledge of the roof, there's a tennis shoe. It's upside down with the shoelace hanging over. Bingo. The when that doctor finished picking up his jaw from the floor in the jaw-dropping experience, he said, "What are you saying? How do you know all of that? Is this candid camera?" And patient after patient would begin to report things that again were not
Right.
possible,
Right.
but were happening. So the phenomena, some of the most strident skeptics were materialist scientists whose minds were blown by what people reported. And similar, John Mack was raised as an atheist by his family. He wasn't raised as an active movement type, an atheist activist, but he's raised in an atheist context, a materialist context, educated as a Freudian, scientific method strictly. He was not, he did not have a predisposition to these kinds of phenomena. He came to them because they came to him. And he said, I'm a scientist, I'm a researcher. I want to follow research where it leads in the same sense that Charles Darwin did.
Hmm.
Charles Darwin was not even officially a scientist. He was a British gentleman who had the time to walk in nature, pick up fossils and track birds and find patterns and make connections and say, there's something going on. But the birds from this island are similar but somewhat different from the ones over there. What is the mechanism by which life is transmitted? Well, we all know that by asking those questions, he changed the course of history with the theory of evolution.
Wow. Well, I mean, time's getting away from us, but I do have a couple more questions, and I think we're going to have to probably do a part 2 because there's so many questions, and people are just loving this and having a conversation with Keith Thompson. Get his book. If you want to hear some of the other topics that we're not even getting to today, just because of time, the UFO Paradox just came out just a few days ago. So please pick it up on Amazon. Go to his website. thompsonatlarge.com. But I do want to talk about spiritual dimensions and what ways do you believe UFOs can represent spiritual and metaphysical events? Because many years ago, growing up, you and I never had cell phones. We didn't have computers. We didn't have social media. We didn't have a lot of like the psychological drugs that they give out pretty much like candy now, to where, it's altering our minds. It's distraction of our minds, even though, we can connect to anybody, anywhere in the world immediately. Do you feel as a journalist, and even just as someone that's interested in this subject, that our connections to, angelic figures or beings or even aliens are being kind of clouded because of our current situation that we're in when it comes to everything is so fast paced and so boggling our minds?
Yeah, I think there's a sense in which the overstimulation, I mean, let's put it this way. Back a century ago in Victorian England, even longer, uh, the the evenings were spent in quiet. There were candles burning.
Right.
Source of light was quiet. And it shouldn't be too surprising that in that culture, the early psychic phenomena, early observation of psychic phenomena, the taking it seriously by Frederick Myers and others in the British Society for Psychical Research, because at that time there was a greater degree of openness, not to necessarily to the ideas, but that the evening time, dusk, would provide uh, a context in which the subtlety of these phenomena could be noticed. I can say for myself, I think many people have had the experience with more of our relatives going through hospice at the end of our lives. We're spending time
Right.
now with our loved ones
True.
in the very last moments of their lives, which is, it's very different from even 20, 30 years ago when death was really out of sight, out of mind. That had become the American way of death. But I sat with my mother dying of cancer in a hospice, and I had already had a near-death experience decades before. So perhaps that had helped reduce any defensive bias or boundary,
Right.
that extra resistance of fear. I'd lost all fear of death in the wake of my experience.
Hmm.
So in that sense, I sat with my mother and I felt in the room near the final moments of her life a gathering of presence and a kind of, I can only say, Tony, a kind of murmuring
Hmm.
that I later
Nice.
discovered is common deathbed visitations of loved ones who come to get their relatives in a kind of field of dreams context. And I remember saying to my mother, I said, "They're coming for you, Mom." I was saying in her ear, she was comatose. I said, "Mom, they're coming for you." So I said to her, all of us, meaning myself and my brothers, we're all okay. We're okay, Mom. You did your job. It's time for you to go. They've come for you, Mom. Love you. Mhm. And so, what is that to say? Is that I think more people are spending time with family
True.
relatives
True.
and experiencing these deathbed. The line between death and life and this world and that world, I think, is getting the permeability between these realms is becoming more obvious. I was going
Yeah.
to say the line between them is changing. It's more that our awareness that it's not a solid line is growing. We're becoming aware that the other world and this world are closely related.
And I think the fear of death is what causes so many people to sometimes have a fear of life, because as we grow older, there's, like they say, nobody gets out of this life alive. And so I think if you just finally come to terms that, that's just what's going to happen, and just enjoy every single moment. Because before my mother passed away 6 years ago, I remember her telling me, she was ready to go, and her mother, who she had never met, was visiting her And I said, oh, she must be preparing you. And we had this open discussion. There was no sadness about it. You know, Mama, I don't want you to go. I knew, you know, it was time for her to make that transition. And before that, I was like, don't take my mama. But after that moment, it was like, you know, I think, you know, I'm okay. And I have been okay. You know, I miss her. I'm sure you miss your mama, but it's one of those things you realize that's just part of life. And unfortunately, fortunately, because I don't want to live forever, but, but, you know, I think that's what the fear of death is, what makes us sometimes have a difficult life.
Seems to be pretty close to a near universal report of the people who come back from near death across different cultures, different religious beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
But this is not the final show. They come back with a certainty. No, it's true that people do not actually die and come
Right.
back. They come to the edge of death and die.
Right.
There might be some examples of technical clinical cessation of life, but strictly speaking, the evidence, the experiential feeling, the evidence of being told, it's time for you to go back. This is not your time to die.
Mm-hmm.
I had something like that. In any case, I came back. I can't say I let go of fear of death. It was no accomplishment.
Right.
I came back free of the fear of death. And
That's a big
and it's
difference.
freedom to live, as you say. It's a freedom to live fully. And that is a big part of what people bring back. And I have no doubt that I don't think the proper distinction is between life and death. I think it's between birth and death.
Right.
We're
Right.
born and we die. Life continues.
Yeah.
What form it continues in, stay tuned. That's a topic. I think life is continuous. It survives physical death because it precedes physical death.
Right.
You know, reality was here before I showed up as,
Right.
as this particular sentient being. And I suspect reality will continue, but I think the reality continues for this sentient being in some other form. But what form? That's the open question.
All right. For the last question, and I'm sure you've heard this before, writing this book, what was your intentions? What did you want people to take away from this book? Was it something that you were just more curious about, or really were you wanting to get what message out to the readers?
I had a very clear sense of going into this, having been at it because I got started so early as a sixth grade student. I can say that I've been at this for decades, and I'm not like 90 years old. You know, I got an early start, and I decided I wanted to write the kind of book I would want to read.
Hmm.
I wanted to, now that the Pentagon had come forward in 2017 to say, oh, yes, this phenomenon about which we've been ridiculing witnesses for 50, 60 years,
Right.
we've been studying it. We can now call it unidentified aerial phenomena, etc. There's a nice, oh, never mind moment. Oh, never mind, it's real. So I thought there's now going to be new readers coming to this phenomenon who, like me, would say, okay, what kind of a book do I want to read? That is written by someone who has an empirical approach and who evaluates the data with a critical thinking, but also with metaphysical imagination, being willing to open. So I wrote the kind of book I wanted to read. I imagined someone coming into the bookstore and picking up my book, which, as you say, is beautifully designed, had a great designer. I couldn't be more happy with the symbolic coloring and shapes. But anyway, I wanted there to be a book like the book that I wrote. So I wrote the book for people who would be finally saying, you know, I've looked at this UFO stuff. I'm not a Shirley MacLaine out on the limb New Ager, but I'm open to big time thinking. And this guy seems to be I wanted to be a trustworthy narrator and the kind of trustworthy narrator that I would want to read. So I decided to write the kind of book that I wanted to read. And I'm feeling good about it. I'm feeling good that I accomplished that.
And when is the audiobook coming out?
Well, the audiobook was supposed to be out, a little bit of a technical difficulty there. It didn't come out at the same time, but I'm told within about 10 days or 2 weeks, I'll be able to find it at all the platforms, including Audible.
Oh,
And I
great.
narrated the book, which is quite an adventure. You don't really know and I'm sure you know as a broadcaster, you don't know what you've done in terms
Right.
of writing until you really sat in a studio and read it for hours. I didn't know what I'd written until I actually read it out loud to myself. I said, oh, that's what you've done. You know, hear your own voice read it. So for those who like audio books, it'll be coming up soon.
Did you say when you're reading, you're like, damn, this was good?
Or at times it was, oh, I wish I'd cut out a few adjectives. You know, the
Okay.
adjectives are always the bane of a writer. And a good editor, I had a great editor, though. She helped me with, I always say, my editors make my work better, and they really do. You go into it thinking, oh, they're going to change what my, my, my genius, but they help bring out the genius of a book.
Awesome. Well,
Good editors.
Keith, you are amazing, and please, invitation open to come back and talk more, because there's lots of things that we didn't even get to. Edgar Mitchell and some other topics I'd love to talk to you about. So please come back. And where can people again find your book and follow you? Do you have any conferences you're going to be at or book signings?
I don't have any book signings or any events planned, but the book itself is at all the online places, Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, bookstore.org, I believe it's called. And then, of course, there's your neighborhood bookstore. It's available as a print book. It's available as an ebook, and the audiobook is coming up. And as for contact with me, all of the sources for purchasing the book are at my website, which is thompsonatlarge.com. Thompson with a P, thompsonatlarge.com.
And get that gorgeous book. Look at that. Look at the colors.
Beautiful.
It is. It's beautiful. So thank you, Keith, and come back and see us again.
Thank you. I appreciate it. We just scratched the surface. Let's go
We
deeper.
did. We did. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We really enjoyed having your comments, being my co-host for today. Please, every Friday, we are here at 3 o'clock, and make sure you tune in on Mondays for Robert Hensley with Minuteman Report, Bonnie Burkert with Truth Be Told Transformation, and then, of course, me every Friday. And then coming up on August 2nd, my Earthly Beings Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization to preserve ancient cultures and traditions. We're having a hot summer seance with Patty Negri in Newhall, California at the Main Theater. It's sponsored by Earthly Beings and the Main Theater in the city of Santa Clarita. Please come up, get your tickets. They're going fast. It's only 2 weeks away from tonight, so make sure you get them. And but until next time, I'm Tony Sweet. Take care of yourself and each other.